Within a company, a rebrand can be a surprisingly difficult project to rally support for. Today we're talking about the internal blockers inside your company, the things that stop a brand overhaul, and ways to navigate around the objections of the naysayers to make the big picture happen. MC.
G'day, Dave.
Let's pull this topic apart.
Yeah.
Let's begin with maybe a little bit of conversating about why it's so hard for brand managers or CMOs to rally support for a rebrand. And also maybe we talk a bit about how there's some difficulties for the CEO as well too. So it's not always just brand managers trying to get this over the line with the leadership team. It can sometimes actually happen the other way around. But yeah, let's step through it. Let's try and figure out what are the factors.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, I guess the first thing that I think of is the emotional attachment. You know, there's a lot of emotions involved when you're considering branding, and so there's a bit of emotional attachment there to the old brand. So it can be hard for people to let go or want to let go, especially if you're in a situation where a brand manager's come in and they weren't part of the old guard, but you know, the CEO was or the founder was, and they're being told, you know, your brand's no good anymore. That can immediately be a bit of a jarring experience, you know, to deal with.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a big one. Yeah, I think when I was thinking about this topic, I was thinking about time and the time factor as kind of being one of the difficult aspects. So just to kind of build on that, like a brand rebuild is a fairly big undertaking. Even if you're a small business, like it can be quite disruptive. But the bigger you are, kind of the bigger the project also becomes as well, because there's more stuff to touch with a brand. And the simple fact is that a rebrand can take many months. It can take a year even to kind of run through the process from start to finish. So time can be a critical factor, which kind of leads into this second idea about distraction, and distraction being one of the challenges, because I think if you think about a brand manager's role or a CMO's role, like it's business as usual, and then you have the rebrand that sort of sits over the top of that. Yeah, and I think that can make it quite difficult, sort of shifting away from the urgency of today. And looking at kind of like what are those more, you know, future critical projects that need to be done, and brand definitely sits in that category. Yeah,
and it ties into something else I was thinking about, which is it might just be seen as a hassle. You know, like why do we need this hassle? We've got a logo already. You know, it's just going to be upheaval and time, as you say, taken away from other tasks. Like, you know, there's a big question why. You know. Yeah, against I guess that input of time and cost.
Yeah, hassle's I mean that's definitely one that I didn't think of, but I mean hassle is definitely one that kind of plays into people's personality traits. Yeah, and I guess hassle and change are maybe kind of two that are kind of interlinked in a way. Yeah. Let's face it, people don't like change, and I think that's one of the really key uphill battles that you have to fight with a rebrand, is that people feel really comfy with the current brand, and they know it, and they might know that it has some, you know, kind of aspects of it that are not quite meeting the benchmark, or that needs to be overhauled, but they're comfortable with it, and I think, you know, they're uncertain about what change might mean for a brand.
Well, that's the uncertainty, as you say, is an interesting one, because I guess we would associate it usually with, rebrand's going to build all this opportunity, but they may think, you know, even if they see some of the current flaws, this could be worse, you know. What if we make it worse? Which is something I hadn't even thought of till just then. But yeah, as you say, for me, that comfort level, you know, they're comfortable with the current branding goes hand in hand with that sort of emotional attachment that I was talking about off the top, where it's just it might be all they've known, and maybe for a long time, you know. So that's a hard thing to let go of.
For sure, yeah, I think that's a big one. Look, you can't have this conversation without kind of talking about politics as well. And you know, the politics that happens within a company, that happen at kind of all levels and all sizes. And I think politics is a factor. Anytime you've got people involved in decision making, you're going to have politics. And I think quite often brand managers are kind of seen as a bit like kind of maverick,
Yeah.
and a bit cavalier, like
Yeah.
you know, kind of like let's go and do this thing, and doing it without kind of much consideration, just because they want to change it, just for the sake of change. And we've talked a bit about that in other podcasts. Like change for the sake of change is not a reason to rebrand.
But I think you're right that there is almost a persona attached to the marketing department. You know, that even the stuff they do is fluffy, or you know, for the sake of it, or especially if someone new is coming in, that you know they're only doing it to put their stamp on it. So I think there is, as you say, almost a bit of bias before you even start, as to what's the motivation behind the idea or the project.
That's definitely a big factor for sure.
Yeah.
What else have you got on your list? I'm curious to know.
I mean, the big one that we haven't talked about really, I guess, is cost.
Yeah.
You know, no one wants to spend the money, especially again, that's what's one of the things, I guess, that's unique about the rebranding as well, as we've sort of talked about, and why we're focusing on it a bit, is that some of those differences is, I think everyone pretty much accepts that when you start a business, you know, you need some level of branding, so they're willing to pay that cost. And you know, most founders, I'm sure, when they sit down and tap out their costings and you know what they're going to need in terms of capital to start their business, would put some money aside for brand and marketing. But in terms of actually finding that money in the general flow of year to year, you know, budgeting and P&Ls, suddenly inserting, you know, a decent cost, you know, can feel very out of the blue or not planned for. And you know, again, if there's any sort of comfort or attachment to the current brand, it'd be like, okay, why are we getting rid of this thing that works and spending a bunch of money and having all this upheaval like we talked about? So it can be hard to justify that cost, I guess.
Oh, definitely. I mean, that is a big factor. I think you could almost put that at the top of the list. Cost is a huge underlying factor. Yeah. It can be the handbrake to a rebrand.
Yeah.
Because not only have you got to contend with, okay, well, we need to create the strategy and we need to create the identity and the messaging and all the other factors of it. But then when it shifts into like a physical sense, like let's say you're a services firm who have multiple locations, you have to think about, okay, what does that mean for environmental branding?
Yeah.
What does that mean for signage? What does it mean for all my collateral? Like, you're pretty much like throwing everything out and you're starting from scratch again. So it can be a significant cost to a business. And
Absolutely.
the bigger you are, the bigger the cost kind of looks like.
For sure.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, and then the final one on my list is actually timing. So I think timing, to distinguish between time as a factor, like how much time it's going to take, but actually timing and when you do a rebrand. So I think sometimes just when the timing is wrong, it's going to be really hard to get a rebrand over the line. Like there might be other projects that are a priority. Maybe the CEO is not the right CEO at the time. But it might be the only issue that you face. Maybe you've got everybody else on board, but timing is just a critical factor. So you know that is definitely something that will kind of thwart a rebrand.
Yeah, I think even almost the inverse of that too, of like not knowing or having some sort of fear of when is the right time. You know, it might be an idea that you want to tackle, but if you feel sort of paralyzed because you don't know when the right timing is to do it, you know, that might just cause that, even if it's that procrastination, you know, to put it off. Oh, it doesn't feel like the right time, or when's the right time?
Yeah, definitely. That's a big one. Anything else on your list?
No, that's all I've got.
Okay, well, I think that's a pretty solid list of objections you've got to overcome.
Yeah. Good luck with that.
Yeah.
Actually, that's the next segment, isn't it?
Yeah. Okay, so, well, I mean, villains might be too strong a word, but who are the naysayers in all of this, and who are those people typically that you've got to kind of convince in the process? It might be interesting to just kind of work through that a little bit and see where you're going to kind of come across some issues.
Who's number one on your list?
Yeah, well, for me, it's the CEO or the founder.
Yeah.
And I think they usually are the blockers to a rebrand. And I often think for them, they're probably thinking about a lot of those factors we just talked before about, like time sink, the distraction, the cost to the business. They're the types of arguments that are going to be thrown around, I think,
for sure.
From a CEO perspective.
Yeah.
How about for you?
Well, I think just with them as well, they're probably, as I mentioned before, going to be probably the biggest champion of the old branding. They probably had a heavy hand in creating it and setting those vision and values even at a strategy level. So you can certainly see why they wouldn't be that keen. The thing that I think goes hand in hand with our last point about cost is the CFO, or if the company has one, or I guess whoever's in charge of counting the pennies. Their main concern really, I guess, is going to be cost, and almost purely cost. They're, again, maybe this is a bit of a stereotype, but they're probably less concerned or less likely to buy in that branding will make a positive difference to the business. So I think for them, they would just see all both the sunk costs, as you say, but all those other costs in terms of opportunity costs or time spent on this versus other tasks, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think that's a big factor.
Yeah.
I think about the CEO as well too. I often think that CEOs are generally they're good generalists is probably the way that I'd describe it. So they've got good generalist skills that kind of allow them to be across many parts of the business, and they're usually good communicators. But they don't necessarily have deep experience when it comes to brand.
Yeah.
And so I think sometimes there's a knowledge gap about what a rebrand might achieve. They've almost got a little blind spot for it.
Yeah.
So I think that's something specific in terms of a CEO and the challenges that you might face from a brand manager's point of view in terms of getting them over the line.
Yeah, to build off that too, the idea that they might be a generalist, they probably feel like they have a good handle on marketing, and that they know all there is to know. And sometimes we see, I guess, that a little bit of knowledge in any area can be dangerous in the sense of, they probably did a pretty good job, but to do a really good job will probably take a bit more expertise. So that can be, I guess, another blocker for them, is to think, well, from based on what I think and I know, we're fine already. Everything's hunky dory.
Yeah. I think also too with CEOs, they tend to be very focused on what's happening right now in their business. And look, if they're a good CEO, they're going to be visionary, so they're going to be doing a bit of both, like focusing on what's going on today in their business, but also what's ahead. And that generally distinguishes between a decent CEO and a not so decent one. And I think, that also can be a challenge if you have a CEO who's very much focused on what's happening this quarter, as opposed to where do we go in 4 quarters time.
And what's interesting about that really is that, as we talked about on the last pod, with signs of when it is time to rebrand, what you're talking about there in terms of focus on the now might be exacerbated if the business isn't doing so well, so
definitely, yeah.
There's often a thought when, whether it's your CEO or my CFO, where if things aren't going as well, even though a rebrand could be part of, a broader strategy to improve the business, the thought of actually spending extra money at that point in time on something like marketing can just feel, too much to bear, even if it might actually be one of the things that could help turn things around. So what you're talking about there in terms of focusing on the now could be exacerbated by that scenario.
Yeah, and I don't want to paint CEOs in a really terrible, villainish kind of light.
No, you did use the word villain.
I did use the word villain. But there's a lot coming at a business leader.
Yeah.
And I think as a brand manager, you've also got to be aware of that fact as well too. There's a lot of decisions they need to make in a day. There's a lot of things that they're focusing on. So we do need to cut the CEO a bit of slack in that regard.
For sure.
But I think it's really on the CMO or the brand manager to recognize that and to think about, be wise about the timing and when you approach a CEO, about the rebrand, and be really clear about how you're pitching it and also how to sell the upside of that brand as well.
Yeah. Well, I think that's really what we're talking about here, is trying to understand things from these other people's perspective so that you can then, I guess, put together an argument as to why, how to overcome those things that they might be thinking or where they're coming from.
Yeah. And I think conversely, if you flip that scenario around as well, brand managers can actually be the culprit here as well.
For sure.
Especially the ingrained brand manager who's been in the role for, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years.
Yeah.
I think the longer in the tooth, sometimes the more rusted on they are to a current brand. So I mean, you could have a situation where a new CEO is inbounds, come into the business. They've got, they've got fresh ideas and they want to kind of rework the entire brand. That can be a difficult situation for a marketing team as well.
Sure. Do you think there's anything unique about the brand manager in that scenario and objections that they might have that we haven't already touched on?
Well, I think that they've probably worked on it. So the brand manager's probably worked on this brand for the last 3 or 4 years. So it's their precious little baby. And we see it so much in the work that we do that people become so passionate about their brand, so protective of their brand, sometimes to their detriment.
Yeah. It's a good thing and a bad thing.
It's a good thing and a bad thing, exactly, yeah. So then you get this CEO come storming in, they've got new energy, they've got new perspective, and they want to make a mark. And sometimes they can just ride roughshod over the whole marketing team.
Yeah.
And I think if you don't have a marketing team's buy-in, then you're probably not going to get very far down the path. You almost might have them antagonistically working against you in a rebrand scenario. You force a rebrand on a marketing team. You want them to be on board. You want them to be bought in. So I think, the CEO's got to be really careful that they avoid we're doing it as a statement and shifting it more to how can we do this together. So I think, the CEO has to think very carefully about bringing that team along the journey with them.
Yeah. Good point.
All right. So that's a lot of the roadblocky kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And I think if you're a brand manager, you're probably, potentially nodding away, thinking, yeah, I know some of those, I recognize some of those, those signals. How do we get past some of these roadblocks? Because they do seem like kind of big impediments to rebranding.
Yeah. Well, for me, the first thing is trying to understand things from the business's point of view. Like if it's a collective of those people that we've talked about and the objections that they have, I think this sort of thinking as to what they care about, why would they want or not want to rebrand? What are the things that would be attractive to them about those kind of things? Certainly painting a picture of the future state of where you're going to get to is a big one. But yeah, I think for the most part, a lot of the objections that we've talked about relate to, let's call them business matters, whether it's, time, cost, resources, what am I going to have to put towards this thing? So I think the counter to that is, well, how do you make a rebrand a business issue, And that comes down, I think, to trying to quantify or at least understand as best you can and put forward as best you can the business outcomes that you're going to get from this, So what are the things that a new brand would allow you to do as a business, whether that's market better or attract more clients, drive more revenue, those sorts of things. I mean, it can be very hard to put a figure on that and quantify it completely, but there is a better way, or at least a way to change that focus from brand being fluffy and just about visuals to this actually impacts the business, and the things that those people that we talked about care about.
That's a great point. I mean, the point you make about it being a business issue, like that is really the job of a CMO or a brand manager, is to make it a business issue.
Yeah.
Because that's such a critical thing to identify, I think, in a rebrand is how strategically this will play into growth and revenue and to all those other good things that a rebrand will do.
Yeah.
But definitely aligning it with a business issue rather than we're just trying to make things look better.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And that comes, back to that understanding of knowing as much as you can about what the people in your business care about, what their objections might be, as we've talked a lot about. And so almost going through them one by one and thinking about how can you counter that, or how can you, make it clear that, okay, this might be a short-term cost, but in the long term, it's going to be a gain, those sorts of things.
Absolutely.
And even thinking beyond just the impact to the bottom line. But again, if you come back to that understanding idea, and if you know that your CEO cares a lot about culture, we'll talk about the impact that brand and rebrand could have on the culture.
Yeah.
If it's going to get the team really energized and happy and, more productive, like there's even a productivity angle here, around rebranding.
Yeah, that's a big one.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing I would say to a brand manager, if they were sitting across the table from me right now, is that you really need to do your homework before a rebrand takes place. I think you got to think about the strategic purpose, which is a lot of what you've just been talking about. Strategic purpose. You've got to have a real reason for a rebrand. It can't just be a kind of made up, illogical kind of. I think it would just look nice.
Yeah.
Or it'd be more to my personal taste.
Yeah.
So you got to think through that stuff logically, and you've got to talk it out with other humans as well too, just to make sure that you've got some sounding board. So you can do a lot of kind of round the table water cooler kind of talk before you even get into those leadership kind of discussions.
Yeah.
To make sure that you've sanitized the brand pitch to everybody.
Do you see that as a way to maybe rally support too?
Definitely, yeah. I think there's a bit of strategy in that as well too.
A bit of politics.
A bit of politics, yeah, definitely. And I think also too, what you should do is look at what's happening in your vertical. So if you're in the e-commerce space, for example, look at what others are doing in the e-commerce space. Like spend a bit of time researching the market, put your head up, have a look around, and start pulling together your research. And then look outside of your vertical as well too. What are some of the brands that you really admire? Then you start collating information around that. And then I think the final step in all of that is look at brand studios who are doing great work. And maybe make a short list and have some exploratory conversations with brand studios just to kind of understand more about the process. I think that's important because all of this is about basically building up a deck that collects all of your thoughts. And even I would go to the point of getting that deck designed up professionally as well too, and walk in there like it's a pitch for a new business. I think that's probably something that's really important. Don't just put it on a shitty little keynote and hope that it's going to get a great response. This is a big undertaking, so it needs a big research piece. It needs a lot of thinking through, and it needs to be done in a professional kind of way.
Yeah, well, you're looking to sell the idea essentially, right? You know, especially if there are as many objections as we were talking about before. You've got to take people from a place of being against the idea to for it. That's going to take some pretty good persuasion.
Definitely. Persuasion's the word.
Yeah. And, to feed into that, one of the other things I was thinking about is actually getting down in a clear visual way what's really going on. And what I mean by that is, like, if one of the reasons for your rebrand is there's heaps of inconsistency as to how your brand is presented across the web and collateral and all those things, actually put all those visuals on one of those slides in your deck and, really show someone how bad it's gotten. Because I think one of the things is that CEO or CFO might not realize, I guess, the reality of what things are,
Well, yeah, it comes back to that point you were talking about before about them just having the fire hose out and dealing with today's issues, not having the chance to have a look around and look at things more deeply, like a brand manager may have the time and expertise to look at.
Yeah, exactly. So, show them the flaws, I guess, in what's happening at the moment. Show them the competition, like you said. It's like if one of the reasons for a rebrand is because you are falling behind in terms of where everyone else is at in your market. Show that to them. Don't just talk about it, but show it. And a really powerful one too, I think, in that regard too, is it'd be interesting to talk to these people, outside the constructs of a rebrand. Just talk to them about what the brand means, what they think it means. Do they think it means premium? Do they think it means bold? Those sorts of things, and not just the leadership team, but as you said, anyone around the water cooler. And then one of those slides in the pitch deck might be, well, this is what we think our brand stands for. But then if you actually look at it from an objective point of view, is it meeting those things, those values or not still? And you could probably put together a pretty compelling case that it's not, so almost these are your words. You said that we need to stand for this, this, and this. Well, currently we stand for these other things, In order to fix that alignment, we're going to have to look at the rebrand.
Yeah,
process.
alignment's definitely a critical factor for sure, and I think it's a nice way of kind of summarizing, like those differences.
Yeah.
If we're to look at some of those roadblocks that we talked about, like up front, and address those kind of more specifically, I mean, the time factor how much time it takes to do a rebrand. Have you got any thoughts in particular about how you might overcome that as a as a brand manager or a CMO?
Yeah, I think the first thing to really understand is that, I guess you want to try and get to a point where you believe that the time cost that it is inevitably going to take is worth it, so that you can justify the time. And I think so much of time, like we were talking about, is opportunity cost. Like, what else could I be doing in that time, day to day as a marketing manager, etc. So I think that's where if you can get true buy-in to the long-term benefits, you can understand that spending time on it, will actually be better for the bottom line, etc. And then I guess beyond that, it's really just trying to work out the best way to fit it in with the other opportunities and other tasks that you do have.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking through this. If I was in the brand manager's shoes, how would I overcome that particular objection? Because you're going to get it from your CEO. They're going to say, look, you're really busy. You've got a lot on your plate.
Yeah.
The timing is all wrong around this. And a really practical step I think you could take as a brand manager is, if you're going to bring in, there's most likely you're going to bring in an outside studio or an agency to work on these types of projects, unless you've got the internal capability, which a lot of companies don't have. And even if they do, it's not usually a good idea. You want that outside influence. But if you get an experienced studio on board, you can actually take the time burden off your shoulders. So just in practical terms, like structuring a full day workshop as a kickoff, like if they're a decent agency, they will get a lot of information and mine the heck out of that session and get as much as they possibly can down, rather than cuts by, like 1,000 cuts. It's just like you get as much information as you possibly can, and you let that agency run for like 3, 4, 5 weeks without you necessarily having to be there on a day-to-day basis. Give them enough. Like, that's a little productivity hack, I think, that you could be using to gain back your time in this process, to take the time burden away from your company. It may not have to be a situation where you have to be doing it every single day and answering emails from the brand studio. Give them what they need and then let them go and work, because the good agencies will be able to just take that and run.
Yeah, it's a good one.
What about distraction?
Well, I guess certainly what you just talked about would be a good workaround with that as well. I guess.
Yeah, I think the one that I saw, that one, in terms of, if we're talking hacks here for a second, the one thing I thought you could do is you could actually look at the stuff that you're currently doing and how you could automate some of those things, and practically show your CEO how you can automate some of the tasks that are currently being done by you in a manual way. So it's just thinking about your workload and how you can be a bit more clever about that. And also just handing stuff off as well too. There's just going to be things that are urgent but not that important. And I think it really comes down to thinking about the rebrand as being something that's really important to the business, and getting all the urgent stuff and shifting that. Some of that's just pure time management stuff. You will need to clear out a bit of your week to focus on a project like this. But between those two things around, getting an agency that will do workshops and mine as much information and stay out of your hair as much as they possibly can, and plus, being able to, shift some of those, those things that aren't really producing that much, in terms of your day-to-day workflow, then those two things alone can be very helpful.
Yeah, I think it's probably a good time to also reflect on what is and isn't working. There's probably a bunch of stuff that you're doing in your marketing plan. You're doing it because it's part of the plan, but maybe, it's time to take stock and cut back even on some things, even if that's kind of a temporary thing during this phase where you're sort of a little bit less active on the marketing front. You keep doing the things that work, but maybe you sort of cut bait on some of the stuff that's taking up your time. If you're sending email newsletters and poring over them for a week, for example, but you're getting really low open rates, then maybe you can actually just fully pull the pin on some of that stuff and sort of almost go into a bit of a sort of quieter phase while you focus on the new stuff.
Yeah, I mean, we talk a bit about, kind of being the conductor, and that is really, that conductor mentality for a brand manager is like, okay, well, now I need to just be a little bit more hands off during a process like a rebrand, and shifting some of those things to either agency partners to do, or getting rid of them altogether, or passing them to somebody else in your team, depending on what your situation is.
Yeah, exactly. Cool.
Politics. Oh, that's a tough one, right?
Yeah.
I was thinking about how do you get around the politics of a rebrand, and I think it is almost like a case-by-case type situation.
Yeah.
Like, it's a difficult one. But I think the best thing that you can do in this regard is to bring the blockers along for the ride.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is understand what problems they're facing, and then think about how the rebrand might address those. So if the CEO, for example, the CFO has an issue with, he needs to cut 10% of the workforce because the numbers just aren't stacking up. Well, potentially a rebrand can reverse that situation. If you kind of get better market alignment, you're able to charge a bit more for your products. Maybe you can get that P&L looking a lot better. But I think it's actually about sitting down with those people who you think are potential blockers, and who might kind of railroad you a little bit, and actually kind of bringing them into the camp, and actually taking the time to understand what is their challenges and their problems.
Yep.
And then seeing if you can talk your way around what some of the advantages of a rebrand might look like.
Yeah. Well, I think you said it before too, in terms of not just getting them involved in the decision necessarily, but also involved in the process. Mm-hmm. And that might not be true for everything. Maybe you're not going to get the CFO completely involved in colour picking, but certainly when you think about that dynamic between the CEO and marketing manager, I think you even put it before, not just telling them this is what's going to happen, but talking to them about how we can do this together. I think a lot of people get a big kick out of being involved in a process like this. And there's other benefits to that too. You're going to have a lot more buy-in to the result if people feel like they're involved in the creation of it as well. And that just doesn't even have to be the people that we've talked about, but anyone across the team.
Yeah, inclusive. That's a big factor, actually. Inclusiveness in a process is important, even if it's just in those early stages. Sometimes putting those people in can yield interesting results. And if nothing else, you brought them along to a certain point in the ride.
Yep.
They feel good about it, and okay, maybe they might drop off over time, but you've done the right thing, and ultimately you've achieved your objective, which is to get a rebrand over the line.
Yep.
Costs, that's going to be a big factor, right? So costs are a real challenge, and it's probably going to be, like we were talking about, it's probably going to be the number one thing that gets talked about in a rebrand is the costs of doing it versus the return on investment.
Yeah.
It's always going to be difficult. And I think the thing is, if you're a brand manager, you really want to get your accounting nerd on here. I think you want to get a bit nerdy with the numbers. And it's usually you're finding that brand managers are typically creative people who don't love numbers that much. But I think it's pretty crucial that you try and link it, in some way, shape or form, to some, tangible, a P&L of some sort, or some numbers that support it.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. We've talked a lot about how hard it is to quantify the impact of a brand, but I think even if you just look at some really sort of top level examples, you could at least start to understand what it might mean. And what I mean by that is, do we think that this could lead to 10 new projects a quarter? And what's an average project worth to your business? It might not be exactly, the number that you're going to generate, but if you can get a feel for what that would mean to your business, suddenly at least you're putting some sort of numbers against what you're talking about, instead of just saying, I think it could be really good. At least you have some sort of framework to work from then.
Yeah, that's a good one, actually. So you're actually even pulling it out of the P&L, and you're actually just looking at, okay, what would this mean at a product or a service level? If we could sell 10 more of these widgets or 10 more of these services, what would that mean for the impact to the business? Yeah, I think it's nice to look at it through that lens. Yeah, my final piece of advice on this one, if you're a brand manager, is just Google ROI on branding, because there is a ton of articles around ROI, and we could do a separate podcast just on the ROI factor.
Yep.
But there's a bunch of stuff that you can see online in and around this, and it might be interesting just to get your head around that, to understand how some of these people who analyze these types of things speak about those issues, and you can just steal a bunch of that for your deck, and make sure you just chuck that in your deck. But Google ROI on branding.
Yeah, and the last thing for me on cost is just, I guess, trying to look at any ways that you could potentially stagger those costs, and talk to your agency partner about that as well if you are hooking up with someone to do it. It's not always possible, and it can be tricky to sort of roll it out in a staggered approach, but there certainly can be opportunities where you just don't have to eat that entire cost right at the very beginning. You can spread it out in stages.
Yeah, that's a good one. With the question of timing, because we talked about how timing can be the factor, I was thinking about ways that you could overcome this as a hurdle, because I think you might have to spend 6 to 12 months just doing your homework before you even go and pitch a rebrand. I think you've got to be careful being the inbounds, brand manager coming into a new business, and in your first 3 weeks you're talking about rebrands. I think you've really got to get your head around a brand first before you start talking rebrand. So I think that's a trap for young players, but I think it's important that you do spend the time to do the research phase and make sure that you do your homework, pull together your deck, because when the opportunity presents, that's when you want to be ready to go and have those conversations. So a few of those opportunities to me look like the business is tanking, and they need to do something. So that's a critical moment in a business.
Yeah.
That's when you want to be ready to put that deck out in front of somebody and have that conversation. You're not being predatory about it. Like, I don't think it's that. I just think you've just done all of your homework. You're ready to go with this, and the business is looking for answers, and you've got one of the answers. It's not all of the answer, but you've got one of the answers, which is that if you see an opportunity for a rebrand, then that's the time to pull it out.
Yeah. Well, as you say, in terms of understanding the brand, I think it's also about understanding the business. So you might even make it more of your job to understand a bit more about the financial goings on of the business, and how profit actually works, and what are the cost triggers and all those sorts of things, but also keeping track of performance. So you talked about it there when things almost are going quite badly, but maybe if you're really in touch, you can see when things are even just starting to wane a little bit. So get out ahead of the problem, even earlier.
That's a big one. Yeah, I agree with that. I think the other factors, like uncertainty, like when you're just a bit unsure or there's a bit of unrest in the company, it may not necessarily be the business is tanking. It's just a bit of uncertainty about what's happening in the market. Again, that presents itself an opportunity just to have those conversations. I think you can also be in the coasting zone as well too, where you just, business is fine, things are coasting along. That almost is a sort of a canary in the coal mine in a sense as well too, that potentially you're just not assessing the market the right way, or the business is not assessing the right way. So maybe that's a time to also, kind of think about, okay, right, we need to get a bit more strategic about what we're doing with our brand. Look, anytime a new CEO comes into a business, great opportunity, because they're going to be coming with a fresh set of eyes, and they can be your biggest champion in trying to get this through. We talked about how the CEO can be the blocker, but the CEO can also be the guy that just makes that decision, because he kind of sees things in a different way, or she sees. Yes, don't worry, I was being politically correct. And then the final factor here is like aggressive growth plans. Like if the business is really going after a big target, and you think that the brand that you've currently got is it's going to break before you get to that aggressive growth target. That to me is another factor, another timing factor, that that is the time when you want to roll that pitch deck out and have those conversations. Yeah,
and I think that's a good point, in the sense of, like, it doesn't just have to be reactive; it can be proactive too. And that's probably when it's actually more exciting, as you say. Maybe things are going okay, but they could be better. Or, we've seen this a bit where when you do your first round of branding and you're sort of breaking into the industry, you're quite different. everyone, then turns around and looks at you as kind of the disruptor, and then they all start copying you. So certainly continuing to be ahead of the market, is a factor in terms of timing as well.
Yeah, I like that front foot. Just be on the front foot the whole time with those things. I mean, I think you've got to have a good nose for these things. Like you have to notice the sort of the tectonic shifts that are happening in a business. You got to sense the mood, which sounds a little bit spiritual in a way, but I think you've got to pick your moment. You've got to do it right. You've got to be armed with your research. You've got to have your prezzo. You've got to pitch it the right way. But if you step through all of that and you're ready to rock and roll, and then you can either be on the front foot or you can be there reactive as well if once one of those shifts is happening in the business.
Cool.
All right, well, that sounds like a nice place to call time on the podcast for this week. So Laz is a weekly podcast. It's a conversation between two brand blokes. If you want to hit us up, if you've got any questions, you can hit us up at ply.studio. You can find our email addresses there. If you want to learn more about building a brand, you can listen to some of the other episodes that we've recorded, either at the layerspodcast.com website, or you can also find us on good podcast platforms like Spotify and Apple Podcasts. That's it, MC.
Lovely. Thanks, Dave.
Thanks for listening, and talk to you next time on Layers.